Marcus Williams stood motionless in the processing room, his wrists locked in standard tissue handcuffs, watching something that shouldn't have been possible unfold before his eyes. The correctional officer's hands moved with deliberate precision, taking the first envelope and tearing it cleanly down the middle. The sound cut through the ambient noise of the facility like a knife. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He had been incarcerated long enough to understand the dynamics of power inside these walls, long enough to know when to speak and when to stay silent. But this was different. This was his mother's handwriting on that envelope, the careful loops and curves he had known since childhood. The same handwriting that had signed permission slips for school trips and written notes for his lunchbox and filled out his college applications. The officer didn't pause after the first tear. He took the two halves and divided them again, then again, his movements mechanical and unhurried. Pieces of the envelope fluttered down to the concrete floor like leaves falling from a tree. Marcus found his voice, though it came out smaller than he intended, weakened by disbelief. He asked what was happening, why this was necessary, whether there had been some kind of mistake. The officer's face remained blank, no trace of emotion crossing his features, no indication that he had even heard the question. He simply reached for the second envelope, this one addressed in the same familiar script, and began the process again. Marcus's mind raced through possibilities, trying to find logic in what he was witnessing. Perhaps there had been contraband hidden in the letters, though that seemed impossible given that his mother would never jeopardize his situation that way. And besides, the envelopes had already been inspected, already stamped with the official marks that indicated clearance. Perhaps there was some new regulation he hadn't been informed about, some change in policy that required destruction of certain types of correspondence, though nothing in the facility handbook mentioned such procedures, and he had never heard of mail being destroyed rather than simply returned to sender if it violated rules. Perhaps this was a test of some kind, a psychological evaluation to see how inmates responded under stress, though that seemed far-fetched and needlessly cruel even by prison standards. The second envelope joined the first in pieces on the floor. Marcus's voice rose in pitch and urgency. He explained that these letters were from his mother, that she was elderly, that she had arthritis that made writing painful, that she did it anyway because she loved him and wanted to maintain their connection across the barriers of incarceration. He asked again for an explanation, pleaded for the officer to stop, promised that if there was some problem with the letters, he would accept their rejection and ask his mother to resend them in whatever form it was required. His words seemed to evaporate in the air between them, acknowledged by nothing except the continued mechanical destruction of his property. The officer picked up the third envelope. By now, other inmates in the mailroom had noticed what was happening. Some turned away immediately, recognizing a situation they wanted no part of, understanding that witnessing such things could sometimes make you a target yourself. Others watched with hard, knowing eyes, seeing in Marcus's situation a reflection of their own experiences with arbitrary authority, their own encounters with guards who seemed to derive satisfaction from reminding prisoners of their powerlessness. A few looked genuinely disturbed, newer inmates perhaps, men who hadn't yet fully adjusted to the casual cruelty that could emerge in places where one group of human beings held absolute power over another group. Marcus's composure was crumbling. His hands gripped the edge of the window slot where mail was normally passed through, his knuckles whitening with the pressure, his body beginning to shake with the effort of containing his emotions. He repeated his pleas with increasing desperation, his voice breaking as he watched his mother's careful handwriting disappear into confetti. He told the officer about the hours she spent composing these letters, how she would sit at her kitchen table with a heating pad on her hands, taking breaks when the pain became too intense, returning to finish her thoughts because staying connected to her son mattered more than her physical discomfort. He described how she would read each letter aloud to herself before sealing the envelope, making sure every word conveyed exactly what she wanted him to know, exactly how much she loved him and believed in him despite his circumstances. The fourth envelope was destroyed with the same steady rhythm. Marcus was openly crying now, tears streaming down his face, his voice ragged with grief and frustration. He begged the officer to tell him what he had done wrong, what infraction had led to this punishment, promised he would accept any consequence, any additional restriction, any loss of privilege, if only the destruction would stop. He offered apologies for offenses he couldn't name, agreements to conditions he hadn't heard, anything that might preserve even one of the remaining letters. His dignity was gone, stripped away by desperation, but he no longer cared about maintaining composure or preserving pride in front of the other inmates. All that mattered was saving what remained of his mother's words. The officer's expression never changed throughout Marcus's pleading. There was no anger in his eyes, no satisfaction, no discomfort, nothing that would indicate he was affected by the emotional devastation playing out before him. His face remained as blank as a wall, his movements as consistent as a machine performing its programmed function. When he reached for the fifth and final envelope, Marcus's pleas reached a crescendo of desperation that was painful for anyone nearby to hear. He repeated again that his mother had arthritis, that writing caused her pain, that she did it anyway out of love, that these letters represented weeks of her life, hours of her suffering, the only tangible connection between a mother and her imprisoned son. The final letter was torn into pieces that joined the growing pile of confetti on the concrete floor. When it was done, when all 5 envelopes and their contents had been reduced to scraps too small to read, too damaged to salvage, the officer looked up at Marcus for the first time since the destruction had begun. His voice was flat and bureaucratic as he announced that the mail inspection was complete and that no acceptable correspondence had been found. He called for the next inmate to approach the window. Marcus stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened, unable to move his body even when commanded to step away from the window. Tears continued to run down his face as he stared at the pieces of paper scattered across the floor, each piece containing a fragment of his mother's love, a syllable of her words, a portion of the stories and memories and hopes she had wanted to share with him. The officer's hand moved to his radio with practiced efficiency. The gesture was a clear warning that Marcus understood immediately. He could walk away from the window on his own, maintaining at least some small measure of control over his actions, or he could be forced away with the additional consequences of refusing a direct order, disrupting facility operations, and whatever other charges they might decide to add to his record. Marcus chose to walk. His legs trembled beneath him as he turned away from the window, away from the scattered remains of his mother's letters, away from the officer who had just demonstrated with brutal clarity exactly how little power Marcus had, how completely his life was controlled by others, how even the words of love sent from the outside world could be destroyed on a whim without explanation, without justification, without consequence for the destroyer. Another inmate, a man Marcus barely knew, saw him stumbling and moved to help, offering a steady arm and quietly guiding him back toward the cell blocks. They walked in silence because there were no words adequate to the situation, no comfort that could be offered that wouldn't ring hollow against the reality of what had just occurred. Marcus made it back to his cell and sat on his bunk in a state of shock that gradually gave way to waves of grief and rage. He thought about his mother sitting at her kitchen table, carefully forming each letter despite the pain, believing that her words would reach him, that they would provide comfort and connection, that the love she poured onto those pages would survive the journey through the mail system and in the prison. He thought about her checking the mail for his responses, wondering if he had received her letters, perhaps worrying that something was wrong if he didn't write back quickly enough. The immediate aftermath was a blur of conflicting emotions. Marcus felt rage at the officer, at the system that allowed such actions, at the powerlessness of his position. He felt grief for the loss of his mother's words, words he would never be able to read, stories he would never hear, updates about his family that were now gone forever. He felt shame at having been reduced to tears and begging in front of other inmates, though rationally he knew that any of them would have reacted similarly in the same situation. Most powerfully, he felt a deep fear about what this incident meant for his future at the facility, whether this was the beginning of a pattern of harassment, whether he had somehow been marked as a target by a guard who seemed capable of casual cruelty without any visible emotional response. In the hours after the incident, as the initial shock began to fade, Marcus's mind started working more clearly. He realized that he needed to document everything while the details were still fresh, before the trauma of the experience could blur the specifics into a general sense of wrong without the precision necessary for formal complaints. He found paper and began writing, recording the date and time, the officer's name from his badge, the names of other inmates who had been present in the mailroom, the exact sequence of events, the words that had been exchanged, everything he could remember about the incident. His hands shook as he wrote, making his normally neat handwriting messy and difficult to read, but he forced himself to continue until he had captured every detail. The documentation process itself was therapeutic in an unexpected way. By transforming his experience into a written record, by organizing the chaos of emotion into a coherent narrative with timestamps and specific quotes and witness names, Marcus felt like he was reclaiming some small measure of agency. He couldn't undo what had happened, couldn't retrieve his mother's letters or erase the memory of watching them destroyed, but he could ensure that there was an official record, that his version of events existed in writing, that if this case ever came before anyone with authority to act, they would have access to his detailed account created immediately after the incident, while his memory was fresh and uncontaminated by time or subsequent events. He spent the rest of that day and much of the following day refining his written account, checking and rechecking it for accuracy, making sure he hadn't inadvertently exaggerated or misrepresented anything in ways that could be used to discredit his testimony. He knew from experience that the prison system was deeply skeptical of inmate complaints, that the default assumption was that prisoners lied to cause trouble or to retaliate against guards who had legitimately disciplined them for rule violations. His account needed to be unimpeachable, detailed enough to be credible, specific enough to be verified, and carefully worded to avoid any suggestion that he was embellishing or making unfounded accusations. While Marcus was working on his documentation, he was also thinking strategically about how to get information to the outside world. The prison's internal grievance system was the official channel for complaints, and he would certainly use it, but he had already filed one grievance earlier in the week about a different interaction with the same officer, and that grievance had disappeared into the administrative machinery without any visible result. He needed a backup plan, a way to ensure that his mother learned what had happened to her letters, that someone outside the prison walls knew about this incident and could potentially take action independent of the facility's internal processes. This solution presented itself in the form of Thomas Reed, an inmate Marcus knew casually from the education programs they both attended. Thomas was scheduled for release in less than 2 weeks after serving a relatively short sentence for a nonviolent offense. Marcus approached him carefully, waiting for a moment when they were both in the library and could talk without drawing excessive attention from the guards. He explained what had happened in the mailroom, showed Thomas his written documentation, and asked if Thomas would be willing to contact Marcus's mother after his release to tell her what had occurred. He gave Thomas his mother's address and phone number, made him repeat both several times to ensure he had memorized them correctly, and gave him a specific message to relay about the destroyed letters and the need for Dorothy to document everything she had written and to keep copies of future correspondence. Thomas agreed without hesitation, understanding both the importance of the request and the risk that Marcus was taking by sharing this information with someone who was essentially still a stranger. If Thomas turned out to be untrustworthy, If he decided to use the information as leverage for his own purposes, or simply forgot about his promise once he was released and trying to rebuild his own life, then Marcus would have shared his mother's personal information for nothing. But Marcus had watched Thomas in the education programs, had seen him tutoring other inmates in math with patience and genuine desire to help, had heard him talking about his own family and the mistakes he had made and his plans to do better after release. He seemed like someone who would keep his word, and Marcus desperately needed to trust someone because he couldn't do this alone. Thomas kept his promise. 3 days after his release, standing at a payphone in a convenience store several miles from Millbrook, he dialed the number Marcus had made him memorize. A woman's voice answered, cautious and slightly confused by the call from an unknown person. Thomas identified himself as a former inmate who had known her son, explained that Marcus had asked him to call, and then, as gently as he could, described what he had witnessed in the prison mailroom. He told her about the 5 letters that had been torn to pieces, about Marcus's desperate pleas to stop the destruction, about the officer's blank expression and methodical movements, about how Marcus had nearly collapsed on his way back to his cell afterward. He delivered Marcus's message about documentation and making copies and keeping records of when letters were sent and when responses were received. Dorothy Williams listened in silence as Thomas spoke, her initial confusion giving way to shock and then to a rage so intense that Thomas could hear it even through the phone line despite her controlled tone. She asked questions with laser precision, wanting to know exactly which officer had done this, what his full name was, whether Thomas had seen the officer destroy mail belonging to other inmates, whether there were other witnesses, whether Marcus had filed any kind of formal complaint. Thomas answered everything he could remember, though he admitted the limits of his knowledge since he had only witnessed this one incident and didn't know what had happened before or since. When the conversation ended, Dorothy thanked him with a sincerity that made Thomas glad he had kept his promise, then immediately began making plans for what she would do next. Dorothy was not a woman who accepted injustice quietly. She had spent her entire life fighting for her children, fighting against systems and institutions and individuals who treated her family as less valuable, less important, less deserving of basic dignity than others. She had fought the school system when they tried to track Marcus into vocational programs despite his obvious intelligence. She had fought landlords who tried to evict them without cause. She had fought employers who underpaid her and mistreated her because they assumed she had no other options. She had fought social service agencies who treated her with suspicion and contempt when she needed help feeding her children during the months after her husband died, and she was trying to keep the family together on a single income. She knew how to fight, and she knew that fighting meant being persistent, being documented, being willing to make phone calls and write letters and show up in person and refuse to go away until someone with authority took her seriously. Her first call was to the prison administration. She was transferred multiple times, passed from one department to another, each person she spoke with seeming uncertain about exactly who should handle a complaint about destroyed mail. Eventually, she reached a deputy warden, whose title suggested he had sufficient authority to address the situation. Dorothy explained what had happened to her letters, described her son's account of the incident as relayed through Thomas Reed, and demanded to know what the prison was going to do to address this clear violation of regulations and basic human decency. The deputy warden listened with what sounded like genuine concern in his voice. He expressed sympathy for her situation, promised that he would personally investigate the incident, and asked her to send him any documentation she had, including copies of the letters she had sent, if she still had them. Dorothy felt a cautious hope that maybe, this time, the official channels would actually work. That hope faded over the following weeks as her calls to the deputy warden went unreturned. She left multiple messages, each one carefully professional despite her growing frustration, each one requesting an update on the investigation he had promised to conduct. She received no responses. She called again and was told he was in meetings. She called again and was told he was out of the office. She called again and was told he would receive her message and return her call when he had information to share. The return call never came. Dorothy realized that the deputy warden's expression of concern had been performative, a way to pacify an angry family member without actually committing to any meaningful action. The investigation he had promised was either not happening at all or was being conducted in a way designed to protect the officer rather than to determine the truth of what had occurred. Dorothy expanded her efforts. She called a legal aid organization that handled prisoners' rights cases, explaining her situation to an intake coordinator who sounded sympathetic but overwhelmed. The coordinator told her that they received hundreds of complaints every month about conditions in various correctional facilities, that they had limited resources and could only take on a fraction of the cases brought to their attention, that they would add Marcus's case to their review list, but couldn't promise anything regarding timeline or whether they would ultimately be able to help. Dorothy added her name to their waiting list and continued making calls. She contacted the local newspaper, speaking with a reporter who seemed interested in the story, and asked good questions about the details and requested copies of any documentation Dorothy had. The reporter said she would look into it and would contact Dorothy again if she decided to pursue the story. Dorothy never heard from her again, and no story about the incident ever appeared in the paper. She called her church Mount Zion Baptist, where she had been a member for 37 years. Her pastor, Reverend James Mitchell, answered the phone himself, which was unusual enough that Dorothy took it as a sign that she should tell him everything. She described the destroyed letters, Marcus's trauma, her unsuccessful attempts to get action from the prison administration, or help from legal aid or attention from the media. Reverend Mitchell listened to her entire story without interruption, then told her something that made her sit down heavily in her kitchen chair, with sudden hope flooding through her exhausted body. He told her that Mount Zion had recently begun working with a civil rights organization called the Southern Justice Alliance, that the organization had been monitoring conditions at Millbrook and other state facilities for several months, that they were building cases based on patterns of abuse and civil rights violations, and that Dorothy's account of systematic male destruction targeting her son might fit into the larger picture they were developing. Reverend Mitchell made a phone call that afternoon to his contact at the Southern Justice Alliance. 2 weeks later, an attorney named Patricia Gomez called Dorothy's phone and introduced herself in a voice that combined warmth with an underlying steel that Dorothy immediately recognized and appreciated. Gomez explained that she had been practicing civil rights law for over a decade, that she specialized in cases involving abuse within correctional facilities, that she had reviewed the information Reverend Mitchell had provided along with the documentation Dorothy had sent, and that she believed Marcus's case had legal merit not just as an individual complaint, but potentially as part of a larger pattern of discriminatory treatment. They talked for over an hour that first call. Gomez asked detailed questions about the timeline of events, about Marcus's previous interactions with the officer who had destroyed his mail, about any complaints Marcus had filed through the prison's internal grievance system, about whether Dorothy had copies of the letters she had sent, about Thomas Reed's willingness to provide testimony about what he had witnessed, about everything and anything that might be relevant to building a legal case. Dorothy answered every question as completely as she could, sometimes pulling out papers to check exact dates and details, sometimes asking Gomez to wait while she found specific documents in the carefully organized files she had maintained throughout Marcus's incarceration. By the end of the call, Gomez had enough information to begin formal legal action, and Dorothy had something she hadn't felt in weeks since Thomas Reed's phone call had first informed her about the destroyed letters. She had hoped that someone with power and expertise was finally taking her son's suffering seriously. Patricia Gomez moved quickly once she committed to taking the case. She filed formal requests with the prison administration for copies of all grievances Marcus had submitted, for mail logs showing what correspondence he had received and when, for Officer Hicks's personnel file including any previous complaints filed against him, for written policies regarding mail inspection and destruction, for everything that might be relevant to proving that Marcus's rights had been violated, and that the violation was part of a pattern rather than an isolated incident. The prison's legal counsel responded to these requests by denying most of them, citing concerns about privacy, about internal investigation procedures, about the confidentiality of personnel files, about all the standard reasons institutions give when they don't want to reveal information that might be used against them in litigation. Gomez had expected these denials. They were part of the predictable dance of litigation, especially litigation against government institutions with powerful incentives to protect themselves and their employees from legal liability. She filed a federal lawsuit alleging violations of Marcus Williams's constitutional rights, specifically his First Amendment right to receive mail and maintain contact with family, his Eighth Amendment protection against cruel and unusual punishment, and his 14th Amendment right to equal protection under the law. The lawsuit sought financial compensation for the harm Marcus had suffered, but more importantly from a strategic perspective, it sought court orders requiring the prison to turn over all the documents they had refused to provide voluntarily. The prison administration, through their legal counsel, responded with a motion to dismiss the case. Their argument was technical but familiar to anyone who practiced prisoners' rights law. They claimed that Marcus had not exhausted all available administrative remedies inside the facility before filing his lawsuit in federal court, that federal courts should not intervene in prison operations unless and until the prison's internal grievance system had been given a full opportunity to address the complaint, that allowing inmates to bypass internal procedures would flood the courts with frivolous complaints and would interfere with the ability of correctional facilities to manage their own operations. It was a strong argument in the abstract, one that often succeeded in getting prisoners' rights cases dismissed, but it had a fatal weakness in this particular situation. Gomez filed a detailed response demonstrating that Marcus had filed 2 separate grievances through the prison's internal system, that both grievances had been properly submitted according to the facility's own procedures, that neither grievance had received any meaningful response or investigation, and that requiring Marcus to continue filing grievances into a system that was demonstrably non-functional would be pointless and would leave him without any remedy while the violations continued. She attached copies of Marcus's grievances with their submission dates and tracking numbers. She attached affidavits from other inmates describing their own experiences filing grievances that disappeared without response. She built a careful argument that the prison's grievance system, whatever it might claim on paper, was not operating in practice as a genuine avenue for addressing legitimate complaints. The federal magistrate judge assigned to the case, Thomas O'Brien, reviewed both sides' arguments and issued an order denying the prison's motion to dismiss. In his written opinion, Judge O'Brien noted that while the exhaustion requirement for administrative remedies was important and generally should be enforced, there were exceptions when the administrative system itself was not functioning properly or when requiring exhaustion would impose unreasonable burdens on prisoners with legitimate complaints. Based on the evidence Gomez had presented, Judge O'Brien found sufficient reason to believe that the grievance system at Millbrook was not operating as intended, that Marcus had made good faith efforts to use it, and that his case could proceed to the discovery phase. This ruling was a significant victory because discovery would give Gomez legal authority to demand documents and to depose witnesses under oath. The prison could no longer simply refuse to provide information by citing internal policies or privacy concerns. They would have to respond to formal discovery requests or face court sanctions. Gomez could subpoena records. She could require employees to sit for depositions and answer questions under penalty of perjury. She could finally get access to the full picture of what had been happening at Millbrook, not just regarding Marcus's case, but regarding the treatment of other inmates who might have suffered similar violations. The mail logs that the prison was forced to produce under court order revealed patterns that were impossible to dismiss as coincidence or to explain as anything other than systematic discrimination. Over the 18 months that Marcus had been incarcerated at Millbrook, 23 separate formal complaints had been filed by inmates regarding destroyed or missing mail. Of those 23 complaints, 19 came from black inmates. This was statistically significant given that black inmates made up approximately 55% of the total prison population, meaning they were overrepresented in mail-related complaints by a considerable margin. Even more telling, of those 19 complaints from black inmates, 12 specifically named Officer Raymond Hicks as the guard who had destroyed their mail or denied them access to it. Gomez read through each of these 12 complaints with growing anger and determination. The stories were remarkably similar to Marcus's experience. Inmates would be called to collect mail that had already cleared the standard inspection process. Officer Hicks would announce that additional inspection was necessary. He would read through the letters, sometimes taking considerable time, sometimes barely glancing at them. He would then declare the mail unsuitable and proceed to destroy it, often while the inmate watched and pleaded for him to stop. In some cases, he offered vague explanations about security concerns or regulation violations. In other cases, he offered no explanation at all, simply tearing the letters and disposing of the pieces. What made these complaints even more damning was the complete absence of any meaningful response from the prison administration. None of the 12 complaints had resulted in disciplinary action against Officer Hicks. None had triggered serious investigations beyond cursory interviews where Hicks denied wrongdoing, and his denials were accepted without any apparent effort to verify his claims, or to interview witnesses, or to examine any evidence beyond his word. Several complaints had been marked as unfounded with no documentation of what investigation had been conducted or what evidence had led to that determination. Others had simply been filed away with no indication that anyone had ever reviewed them or taken any action whatsoever. Patricia Gomez expanded the lawsuit to include the 12 other inmates whose complaints had been ignored. She reached out to them through their families, explained that she was building a case against both Officer Hicks and the prison administration, asked if they would be willing to participate as plaintiffs. Most agreed immediately. A few were hesitant, afraid of retaliation, even though Gomez explained that federal law prohibited retaliation against inmates for participating in legal proceedings. Eventually, all 12 joined the lawsuit, their stories adding depth and power to the argument that this was not an isolated incident, but a pattern of abuse enabled by systematic indifference from supervisors who should have been providing oversight. Gomez deposed each of these inmates, conducting interviews in the restricted visiting areas of Millbrook under the watchful eyes of correctional officers who were not allowed to interfere with attorney-client communications, but whose presence nonetheless added tension to conversations about guard misconduct. The men she interviewed ranged in age from 22 to 58. They were serving sentences for various offenses from drug possession to assault to property crimes. They came from different backgrounds and had different life experiences. But their accounts of interactions with Officer Hicks were remarkably consistent in their core elements. One inmate, a 43-year-old man named David Martinez, described receiving a letter from his 12-year-old daughter describing her middle school graduation. Officer Hicks had destroyed it, while Martinez begged him to at least let him read it first. Martinez broke down crying during the deposition as he described how his daughter had asked in her next letter why he hadn't responded to her news about graduation, how he had tried to explain without making her afraid that bad people were keeping him from her letters. Another inmate, 26-year-old Jerome Harris, described letters from his grandmother being destroyed weeks before she died. He never got to read her final words to him. He would never know what she had wanted to tell him in those letters. The loss haunted him in ways that made it difficult for him to function even years later. The emotional testimony was powerful, but Gomez needed more than just emotional impact to win the case. She needed to prove discriminatory intent, to demonstrate that Officer Hicks had targeted black inmates specifically rather than simply being generally cruel to all inmates regardless of race. The personnel file she had obtained through discovery provided some useful information. It showed that Hicks had received 3 complaints during his 11 years at Millbrook, all from black inmates, all dismissed after cursory investigations. It showed that he had also received 2 commendations for his handling of tense situations. The file painted a picture of someone who was good at his job in some respects, who could de-escalate violence when necessary, but who had a blind spot or perhaps something more sinister when it came to his treatment of black prisoners. The breakthrough came when Gomez deposed other correctional officers, guards who worked alongside Hicks and had observed his behavior over years. Getting these officers to testify candidly was difficult. There was a strong code of silence among correctional staff, a general unwillingness to speak against fellow officers even when those officers engaged in obvious misconduct. Guards who testified against their colleagues faced social ostracism, harassment, sometimes threats. Many who might have had relevant information refused to cooperate. But a few, when separated from the prison environment and sitting in a lawyer's office under oath with the knowledge that lying would be perjury, were willing to tell the truth about what they had witnessed. Officer David Keene had only been at Millbrook for 2 years. He was 28 years old, had taken the correctional officer position after leaving the military, and still retained enough idealism to be disturbed by what he saw in the facility. During his deposition, speaking slowly and clearly struggling with the decision to testify against a fellow officer, Keene described multiple occasions when he had personally witnessed Hicks destroying mail. He described Hicks's pattern of volunteering to cover mailroom duty, how he would specifically wait for certain inmates and would conduct his additional inspections on their correspondence. Keene testified that he had heard Hicks make racially derogatory comments about black inmates on numerous occasions, using slurs and expressing open resentment about having to work with them. Most damaging to the defense, Keene testified that Hicks sometimes joked about destroying mail after the fact, that he would return from mailroom duty and make comments to other officers about teaching certain inmates lessons or making them cry. Keene admitted under Gomez's questioning that he had never reported this behavior to supervisors, that he had convinced himself it wasn't his responsibility to get involved, that he needed his job and feared retaliation if he spoke up. His testimony was halting and uncomfortable, delivered by someone who clearly felt guilty about his inaction, but was now trying to do the right thing even though it came late and could cost him professionally. Other officers provided similar testimony, though most were more circumspect than Keene, more careful in their wording, more protective of their colleague, even while acknowledging that certain behaviors had occurred. But the overall picture that emerged from the depositions was clear and damning. Officer Raymond Hicks had a documented pattern of making racist comments about black inmates. He had a documented pattern of targeting their mail for destruction. He had done this over a period of years, while supervisors either didn't notice or didn't care enough to intervene. The prison's internal grievance system, which theoretically existed to provide inmates with recourse against guard misconduct, had proven completely ineffective at addressing the pattern, had in fact enabled it by dismissing every complaint without serious investigation. During Officer Hicks's own deposition, he maintained that he had acted professionally and according to regulations in every instance. When pressed about specific incidents, he claimed that the destroyed mail had contained content that posed security risks, though he could not provide specific examples of what those security risks were. When asked why he had not documented these security concerns according to prison policy, he said that immediate destruction was sometimes necessary to prevent contraband information from circulating. When confronted with statistics showing that his mail destructions targeted black inmates almost exclusively, he grew defensive and angry, accusing Gomez of manufacturing a racism claim where none existed, insisting that he was color blind in his enforcement of prison rules and that any disparate impact was explained by black inmates being more likely to receive prohibited content rather than by any discriminatory intent on his part. This argument might have had some credibility if there had been any documented evidence of prohibited content in the destroyed letters, but there wasn't. Hicks had never filled out the required forms documenting why specific mail was being rejected. He had never made copies of offending passages to justify his actions. He had never followed any of the procedures that existed precisely to prevent arbitrary destruction of prisoner correspondence. His claim that he was simply enforcing rules was undermined by his complete failure to follow the rules that governed his own conduct. The case began attracting media attention as details emerged through court filings and depositions. Local news outlets picked up the story first, running pieces about the lawsuit against Millbrook. Regional papers followed. Eventually, national civil rights organizations became involved, holding press conferences on the courthouse steps, bringing attention to the case as an example of ongoing problems with prison oversight and accountability. Dorothy Williams, who had started this entire process by refusing to accept her son's suffering as simply the price of his incarceration, found herself speaking to reporters about the hours she spent writing letters despite her arthritic pain, about the cruelty of having those expressions of love destroyed, about her determination to hold accountable both the officer who had torn up her words and the system that had allowed him to do so without consequence. The public pressure combined with the strength of the legal case created significant problems for the state's Department of Corrections. They faced the very real possibility of a jury trial that would put prison conditions and guard conduct on public display. They faced potential damages that could run into millions of dollars given the number of plaintiffs and the egregious nature of the violations. They faced the possibility of federal oversight being imposed on their facilities if patterns of civil rights violations were proven. The smart move from their perspective was to settle the case before it reached trial, to make the problem go away with money and policy changes before a jury could deliver a verdict that might be even more costly and might generate even more negative publicity. Settlement negotiations began 6 months after the lawsuit was filed. The state's attorneys made initial offers that Gomez rejected as insufficient. They negotiated back and forth over financial compensation, over admission of wrongdoing, over what policy changes would be implemented, over who would monitor compliance with those changes. Eventually, they reached an agreement that gave Marcus and the other plaintiffs substantial financial settlements that required the prison to implement new oversight procedures for mail handling, including video monitoring and regular audits, that mandated training for all correctional officers on civil rights and anti-discrimination law and the prohibition against retaliation, that brought in independent monitors to review the facility's grievance system and recommend reforms, and the settlement required Officer Raymond Hicks to be terminated. The state initially resisted this provision, wanting to handle personnel decisions internally without having them dictated by lawsuit settlements, but Gomez was adamant. As long as Hicks remained employed at Millbrook, none of the policy changes would matter because other guards would see that you could engage in this kind of behavior for years without facing real consequences. His firing needed to be part of the public record, part of the settlement, part of the message that this conduct would no longer be tolerated. The state eventually agreed, though they insisted on vague language in the official termination announcement that cited conduct unbecoming an officer and violations of department policy without specifically mentioning racism or discrimination or the destroyed mail. Marcus Williams was released from Millbrook 3 months after the settlement was finalized. His appeal had been successful, partially because the attention his case had generated led to better lawyers reviewing his conviction and finding legitimate legal issues, partially because prosecutors were more willing to negotiate when the defendant had become a symbol of prison reform advocacy. He walked out after serving 21 months of what should have been a 5-year sentence. His mother was waiting for him in the parking lot, The same parking lot where families arrived to visit loved ones locked inside those walls, where women and children and elderly parents made pilgrimages to maintain connections across the barriers of incarceration. Dorothy had brought something with her, a box filled with letters. All the letters she had written to Marcus over those 18 months, the ones that had made it through and the ones that had been destroyed, because she had kept copies of everything, had preserved her words even when the prison system had tried to erase them. She handed the box to her son, and they stood together in that parking lot while Marcus read letters he had never seen before, letters that Officer Hicks had turned into confetti while Marcus begged him to stop, letters that contained his mother's love and his family's news and the connection to the outside world that had been taken.